All right, so let's talk CrossFit.
Okay.
You know those workouts where everyone's tracking all their numbers and it's all about data?
Yeah.
You'd think that the coaches would be, glued to their spreadsheets and just, really all about that data.
Right.
But a recent study actually found some interesting stuff about how CrossFit coaches are using data in their day-to-day coaching.
Yeah.
So we're going to deep dive into this today.
Yeah, let's do it.
We've got some really cool research to look at.
Yes. So the report that we're going to be looking at today is called Digital Fist Bumps, Searching for Datafication and Digitalization in Everyday CrossFit Coaching Practice.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, it is.
What journal is that in?
This was published in Frontiers in Sports and Active Living just this month.
Oh, wow, so brand new.
Yeah, so it's hot off the presses.
Very cool. And who are the researchers?
This is by Sandra Krogley and Jason Tucker.
Okay, excellent. And I understand that we're also going to be looking at some other research a little bit later on.
Yeah, so we'll also be referencing an article called Unpacking the Black Box, Applications and Considerations for Using GPS Devices in Sport. And this was published in the International Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance back in 2017.
Okay, so a little bit older, but still relevant to this topic.
Definitely.
Excellent. Okay, so we've got the official CrossFit methodology, which, as I mentioned earlier, is all about measuring and tracking your progress with all this data. And then we've got the reality of what's happening in CrossFit gyms, or boxes as they call them.
Yes.
So what did this research reveal?
Well, it turns out that even though CrossFit really emphasizes this data collection, a lot of the coaches in this study actually didn't routinely record data from group training sessions.
Really, that's surprising. Why wouldn't they be tracking all that data?
Yeah.
Those reps and weights and all that stuff. I mean, isn't that like a core part of CrossFit?
Yeah, it seems like there's a bit of a disconnect between what's, preached and what's actually practiced. So the study found that there were actually quite a few different coaching styles and priorities.
Okay.
And for some coaches, they were more interested in the movement quality over just performance scores.
Go.
So they actually felt like recording all the data might actually detract from the participants' focus on actually doing the movements correctly.
So for those coaches, it's more about, getting the movement right than necessarily hitting a certain number.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the coaches in the study, Finn, said that he focuses on how invested the participants are in the session rather than on any specific numbers. So he's really looking at the individuals and making sure that they're bought in and present rather than just, hitting certain numbers.
Yeah, so he's really tuning into their experience rather than treating everyone the same.
Right, and that's a theme that kind of came up over and over again, was this idea of individualization.
Okay, interesting. So if they're not logging, everything in a spreadsheet, how are they keeping track of progress and sharing feedback?
Well, this is where the whiteboard comes in.
The whiteboard, of course.
Sure.
So that's more than just a WOD announcement board,
Right.
I'm guessing.
Exactly. So the whiteboard actually shows a lot about how each CrossFit community functions.
Interesting.
So some coaches use the whiteboard for data sharing, and they encourage everyone to write up their scores, and other coaches leave it up to the individual whether or not they want to share.
Okay.
So there's definitely like a social element to that.
Yeah, it's like a public record of everyone's performance, but, with varying levels of emphasis depending on the coach and the box itself.
Exactly. And there were some great examples from the study that showed this in action.
Okay, like what?
One coach, Leah, actually mentioned that while some people thrive on that competitive energy of seeing everyone's results, on the board, other people just want to come in, enjoy the workout, and not compare themselves to others.
Yeah, I can see how that public display of data could be, kind of intimidating for certain people, especially if they're new to CrossFit or just self-conscious about their performance. So it seems like it's about creating an environment where everyone feels, comfortable.
Right, and that's where the coach's role is really important, is setting that tone and that environment where everyone feels welcome and supported.
Yeah, it's not just about the data itself, it's about how it's used and how it affects the overall experience.
Exactly.
Okay, so we talked about whiteboards, but what about those CrossFit-specific apps like SugarWide? Are those being used?
Yeah, so that was another interesting finding from this study. Only 2 out of the 6 coaches were actively using platforms like SugarWood.
Oh, wow. That's less than I would have expected, especially with, fitness tracking being so popular.
Yeah, you would think that more people would be using those, but it seemed like there were a couple reasons for that.
Okay, what were they?
Well, some coaches thought it was just an unnecessary expense.
Okay, especially for small businesses, every dollar counts.
Exactly, and they felt like, they could achieve the same things with just a whiteboard and good communication.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
And then the other thing was that the coaches that were using it were very specific about how they used it.
Oh, okay. How
So they
so?
were mainly using it for building community and giving individual feedback.
Okay, so more of a, positive reinforcement tool.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So one coach, Molly, even specifically mentioned that she used the platform for digital fist bumps and just taking the pressure off of always having to chase top scores.
I love that it's like a virtual high five, recognizing effort and progress,
Exactly.
not just about, who's at the top of the leaderboard.
Right. It really shifts that focus.
Yeah, it's really cool. And I think it's a good reminder that, it's not always about the data itself, but about how it's used and interpreted.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, let's move on to something maybe a little more high tech.
Yeah.
What about using GPS and MEMS technology in CrossFit?
Ooh, yeah, that's getting really fancy.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about serious data tracking here, right?
Yes, they're like mini labs that you're wearing on your body.
Yeah. Okay, well, before we get into specifics, can you maybe just give us like a quick breakdown of how those devices actually work?
Yeah, so GPS uses satellites to track your location and movement, so it's
Hmm.
good for outdoor activities and,
Hmm.
it can give you data on distance, covered the speed that you reach, and even, how much time you're spending in different intensity zones during a workout.
So, like, if I'm doing a CrossFit workout that involves running a GPS watch,
Yeah.
could track my pace and distance, and even like tell me, how much of that workout I spent at a high intensity.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, that's cool. So what about MEMS? How's that different?
MEMS stands for micro electromechanical systems.
Okay.
It's a mouthful.
Yeah.
And they're basically tiny sensors that can capture more detailed movement data.
Okay.
So they're often built into the same unit as the GPS,
Hmm.
and they track things like acceleration, deceleration, and even, just like the changes in direction.
Oh, wow. So it's like a motion capture system, but just in like a tiny wearable package.
Yeah.
Wow, that's super cool. So are those easy to use? Are they
Mhm.
accessible to everyone, or are we talking about like, elite athletes with, big budgets and things like that?
That's a good question. And yeah, there are definitely a few things to think about when it comes to using those technologies.
Right.
First of all, like you said, they're not exactly cheap,
Right.
especially if you're looking for a higher end model with all the fancy features.
Yeah. So cost is definitely a barrier.
Yes.
Well,
And even if you can afford it, there's definitely a learning curve when it comes to actually understanding all that data.
mhm.
It's not enough to just kind of look at the numbers on the screen. You have to know what they actually mean and how they relate to your training.
Yeah. So you've got to have some data literacy to go along with that technology.
Definitely.
Okay. And that's actually where that article that we mentioned earlier comes in.
Yes. Unpacking the black box.
Yeah, it gives some good guidance on how to actually collect, process, and interpret that data.
Hmm.
So coaches can really make sense of it all.
Exactly. So it's not just about having the data, but about knowing how to use it effectively.
Yeah. Like you said, it's not a magic bullet.
Right. You have to have a good understanding of what it all means.
Okay. Well, this is starting to feel like we're really getting into the, nitty gritty of like elite sports training.
It's pretty cool.
It is super cool. But I'm wondering, for someone who's maybe not super familiar with all this technology, could it be overwhelming?
It definitely could be. And it's really about finding that balance.
Mhm.
There's so much potential to gain these insights from the data, but we want to make sure that it's used responsibly and ethically.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So let's talk about how these GPS and MEMS devices are being used in like a typical CrossFit workout.
Hmm.
What are we actually learning from all this data?
Okay, so let's imagine a CrossFit WOD
Okay.
that involves running weightlifting and gymnastics.
Okay. Yeah. Sounds pretty standard.
Yeah, so the GPS would be useful for tracking the running portion.
Okay.
It could give you insights into your pacing and your overall endurance, but wouldn't be that helpful for the other parts of the workout.
Okay. But what about the MEMS devices? How would you use that for, say, like weightlifting or gymnastics?
Yeah, so that's where MEMS can really shine.
Okay.
Because those sensors can pick up those subtle changes in acceleration and deceleration,
Right.
which can give the coach really detailed look at the athlete's movement mechanics during those more complex exercises.
So like you could actually see if someone is lifting properly or if they're putting too much stress on their joints.
Exactly.
Okay, cool.
And that can be super valuable for preventing injuries, improving technique, and just helping athletes perform better overall.
That is really cool. But I'm guessing it's not quite that simple. There's got to be some challenges, right?
Yeah, of course. So one of the biggest challenges is making sure that those devices are properly calibrated and positioned on the athlete's body.
Oh, okay. So, like they have to be worn correctly.
Exactly. If it's not worn correctly, then the data can be inaccurate. Or even misleading. It's like trying to measure a room with a wonky tape measure. You're not going to get good results.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then I imagine there's also the issue of data overload.
Yeah, absolutely. These devices generate so much information, and it can be really easy to get lost in all the numbers.
So coaches really have to be selective about what they focus on.
Right, and they have to know how to use that information to make good decisions for their athletes.
And that brings us back to those individualized speed zones that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do those fit in with all this GPS and MEMS data?
So remember how we were talking about how you can create personalized speed zones based on an athlete's fitness level?
Right. So instead of just saying, okay, everyone's high intensity running starts at 10 miles per hour,
Yeah.
you actually figure out what speed is really high intensity for each individual.
Exactly. So now imagine you combine those individualized speed zones with GPS data.
Okay.
You can track not only how fast an athlete is running, but also how much time they're spending in those personalized intensity zones.
So you could see if someone is consistently hitting those, high intensity zones, or if they're maybe spending more time in the lower intensity zone.
Exactly.
And that would give the coach a much better idea of how hard they're actually working.
Right. And that's a much more personalized approach than just looking at their overall speed.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
Like we're moving from this one-size-fits-all approach to training to a world where, everything is really tailored to the individual.
It's a pretty exciting time to be involved in fitness.
It really is. But I imagine with all this new technology, there are some important considerations to keep in mind.
Yeah, for sure.
So what are some things that coaches and athletes should be thinking about as we move forward in this kind of digital fitness revolution?
Well, one thing that we already talked about was privacy.
Right.
These devices are collecting all this personal information about, how you're moving and where you're going.
Right.
So we have to make sure that that data is handled securely and used appropriately.
Makes sense?
Hmm.
And are there any other ethical considerations that we should be aware of?
Yeah, one thing to be careful of is using data to, unfairly compare or judge athletes.
Right.
So we don't want to reduce athletes to just the set of numbers.
Right.
And ignore all the other qualities that make them, unique and valuable.
Yeah, it's like saying that the person with the highest VO2 max is automatically the best athlete.
Right, and that's just not true.
There's so much more to it than that.
Exactly. So it's really important to remember that the data is just one piece of the puzzle.
Right. It can be a powerful tool, but it should never replace, human judgment, empathy, and understanding.
Absolutely. It's all about finding that balance.
Yeah, it sounds like that balance between, the data and the human element is going to be crucial as we, kind of navigate this new landscape of digital fitness.
For sure. And that's something that we'll talk about more as we continue this deep dive.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Excited to keep learning.
Me too. So it's really interesting to see how CrossFit is dealing with all this technology and the human element of coaching.
Yeah, it's like we've got all this incredible tech that can measure every little detail,
Right.
but we also don't want to lose sight of, the fact that coaching is more than just numbers.
Right.
But before we go too deep into, the philosophy of it all, let's bring it back to like the practical side.
Okay.
So we were talking about, GPS and MEMS devices.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, like, how are coaches actually using this stuff in their CrossFit programs?
So one of the most common ways that GPS data is being used is to track an athlete's workload over time.
Okay.
So by monitoring things like distance, speed, and the time they spend in different intensity zones,
Right.
coaches can really start to understand, how much stress an athlete is putting on their body during training.
So it's like a super high-tech training log,
Yeah, exactly.
tracking the volume and the intensity of all their workouts.
Mm-hmm. And that information can be super helpful for preventing overtraining and optimizing recovery.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about MEMS? How's that being used in CrossFit?
Yeah, so MEMS data is really valuable for analyzing an athlete's mechanics during those more complex exercises that GPS can't really capture.
Okay, so like when they're lifting weights or doing gymnastics?
Right. So by tracking acceleration, deceleration, and changes in direction, coaches can see how an athlete is performing things like squats, Olympic lifts, and gymnastic skills.
So they can actually see if someone's squatting with proper form or if they're putting too much stress on their knees or something.
Yeah, exactly.
That's really cool. I bet athletes love that feedback.
Oh, yeah, definitely. But it's not as simple as just, strapping on the device and letting it do its thing.
Right. I was just thinking that. There must be challenges with using it effectively.
Absolutely. So one of the biggest challenges is making sure that the device is calibrated correctly and that it's positioned correctly on the athlete's body.
Oh, okay. So like it actually has to be worn, right?
Yeah, if it's not worn correctly, the data might not be accurate. It could be misleading. It's like measuring a room with a wonky tape measure.
That's a great analogy.
You're not going to get good results.
Right. And then there's the whole issue of data overload,
Mhm.
right? Like these things are collecting so much information.
Yeah.
It could be easy to just get lost in all the numbers.
Absolutely. So coaches really have to know what data to focus on.
Yeah. And how to use it to make good decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of reminds me of our conversation about individualized speed zones.
Yeah.
So how do those fit in with, GPS and BEMS data?
So remember how we talked about how you can create those personalized speed zones based on someone's fitness level?
Right.
So instead of just using those generic zones, you're actually figuring out, what speed corresponds to each athlete's individual limits.
Yeah, it's a much more personalized approach.
Exactly. And now imagine combining those individualized speed zones with GPS data.
Okay.
So you could track not only how fast they're running, but how much time they're spending in those personalized intensity zones.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, so you could see if someone is consistently hitting those high intensity zones or if they're spending more time in those lower zones.
That makes a lot of sense. And that would give the coach a much clearer picture of how hard each person's working.
Right. And it's a much more nuanced way to look at it than just their overall speed or distance.
This is really amazing. It's like we're moving away from that cookie cutter approach to fitness, and we're getting this, super personalized, data-driven training.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting.
It is really exciting.
Yeah,
But I'm sure there are some important things to think about as we, continue down this road.
of course there always are.
So what are some things that we need to be mindful of?
Well, one thing that we already talked about was privacy.
Right. All that personal data.
Exactly. We need
Yeah.
to make sure that that information is handled securely
Makes sense.
and used appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
Another important thing to think about is that we don't want to use this data to unfairly compare or judge athletes.
Right.
It's really easy to get caught up in the numbers and forget that there's a whole person behind that data.
Yeah, it would be like, saying the athlete with the fastest mile time is automatically the best athlete.
Right. And there's so much more to it than that.
Like skill strategy, mental toughness, all that stuff.
Exactly. So it's super important to remember that the data is just one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, it can be a really powerful tool, but it shouldn't replace, human judgment, empathy, understanding all those things.
It's all about finding that balance.
Yeah, finding that balance between data and the human element seems like it's going to be key.
Yeah, for sure. And that's something we'll continue to explore as we shift our focus to the world of CrossFit-specific apps.
Oh, yeah, we talked about whiteboards and wearables, but there's a whole other layer of technology that's becoming really popular.
Right.
So let's dive into the world of apps.
Okay, so remember those two coaches we were talking about from the digital fist bumps study?
Yeah, the ones that were using Sugarwood,
Exactly.
they were using it mainly for community building and feedback, right?
Mm.
But what about the specific features? Like, how are those platforms different from just using a whiteboard or a basic tracking app?
Yeah, so there are some key differences.
Yep.
Sugarwood, for example, has some really unique features that make it really great for CrossFit.
Okay.
One of the things that really sets it apart is the focus on positive reinforcement.
Oh, that's cool.
So it's not just about tracking PRs and comparing scores.
Mhm.
It's really about celebrating effort and progress no matter where you are on your fitness journey.
I love that. It's so easy to get caught up in the competition aspect, especially in CrossFit.
Right.
But ultimately, it should be about, pushing yourself and trying to be better than you were yesterday.
Absolutely. And Sugarwood really seems to foster that positive and encouraging environment.
Yeah.
Coaches can use it to give shout outs to athletes who are crushing it, offer support to those who are struggling, and just, create a sense of community.
It's like a virtual high five after a tough workout.
Exactly.
I bet those little encouragements really make a difference.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And another cool feature is that you can actually track progress over time.
Oh, within the app.
Yeah, so coaches can log workouts, monitor PRs, even set goals for their athletes.
So it's like having a digital coach in your pocket.
Pretty much.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That sounds like a really valuable tool for coaches who want to create a more connected and supportive environment.
Yeah, and it can be really empowering for athletes to actually see their progress and have a coach who's invested in their success.
So all this is making me want to download Sugarwood right now.
Yeah, it's a great app.
It sounds really cool.
Yeah.
But I imagine there are also some things to consider before just, jumping in using these apps.
Oh, yeah, definitely with any new tool, it's important to use it responsibly.
Okay.
So one of the biggest considerations with these apps is privacy.
Right.
They're collecting all this data about our workouts, our goals, even our social interactions.
Mhm.
So we have to be mindful of what we're sharing and make sure we're comfortable with how that information is being used.
That's a great point. We were talking about privacy with, GPS and MEMS devices,
Right.
but it's even more relevant with these apps because they're tracking so much of our lives, not just our training.
Absolutely. And another thing to keep in mind is that not all apps are created equal.
Oh.
Some are more focused on data tracking and analysis,
Mm-hmm.
while others are more about community and social interaction.
So it's like anything else.
Yeah.
You got to choose the right tool for the job.
Exactly.
Well, this has been such an interesting conversation. We've gone from simple whiteboards to these high-tech wearables and now these apps that are, changing the whole landscape of CrossFit.
Yeah. It's amazing how quickly things are evolving.
It really is. And it's clear that technology is playing a huge role, but it's also clear that it's not about replacing human connection and expertise.
Right. It's about finding that balance.
Yeah, using technology to make things better for coaches and athletes.
I agree. And it's been so interesting to explore all these ideas with you.
Me too. Okay, so before we wrap things up, I want to circle back to something we were talking about earlier.
Okay.
Those individualized speed zones.
Yeah.
So you explained how those personalized zones combined with GPS data can really give us a much better understanding of an athlete's effort level.
Right.
But can you give us some more practical examples of how that might actually play out in a CrossFit workout?
Yeah, sure. So let's imagine a WOD that involves running intervals,
Okay.
like 400-meter repeats with some rest in between.
Okay, I can picture it.
Now, let's say we have two athletes with different fitness levels.
Okay.
One athlete has an anaerobic threshold of 9 miles per hour, and the other one's is 11 miles per hour.
So that's the point where their bodies are switching from aerobic to anaerobic energy systems.
Exactly.
Okay.
So now imagine they're both running those 400-meter intervals at 10 miles per hour.
Okay.
On paper, it looks like they're working at the same intensity.
Right, because they go on the same speed.
Exactly. But if you look at their individualized speed zones, you see a different story.
Oh.
So the athlete with the lower threshold is actually working at a much higher relative intensity, even though they're running at the same speed.
So they're pushing closer to their limit, even though they're going the same pace as the other person.
Exactly, and that's the power of those personalized zones.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It allows the coach to see beyond just the raw numbers.
Right, and get a more accurate understanding of how each person is responding based on their own physiology.
Exactly.
It's so cool. It's like we're really getting into that personalized approach.
Yeah.
We're not just throwing the same workout at everyone and hoping for the best.
Exactly, and that's the goal.
So I know what you're thinking. Is this only for elite athletes?
Right.
The ones with access to all the fancy equipment.
Yeah, it's a good question.
And I'm hoping that it's not.
Me too, and the good news is it's not.
Okay, good.
So while the technology itself can be expensive,
Right.
the principles behind individualized training are actually accessible to everyone.
Okay, I'm listening. How can someone who doesn't have all the fancy equipment still benefit from these ideas?
It starts with self-awareness.
Okay.
So pay attention to how your body feels during your workouts. Notice your heart rate, your breathing, and how much effort you're putting in.
So really tuning into those internal cues.
Yeah, exactly. And you can also use those perceived exertion scales.
Okay, the ones you see on the treadmills.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So by paying attention to your body and using tools like that, you can start to develop a sense of your own personal intensity zones.
Okay, so you don't necessarily need all the tech to do it.
Exactly. You can start to figure it out on your own.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
But even if you can become, super aware of your body's signals, isn't there still a limit to how much you can do without a coach?
Oh, definitely. A coach can provide so much valuable insight and help you interpret those signals and make adjustments to your training and ultimately help you reach your goals more effectively.
Right. Okay, so it's not, tech versus human. It's really about both.
Yeah, exactly.
Huh.
It's about finding that sweet spot where technology and human connection work together.
Yeah, that's definitely been a theme throughout this whole conversation.
Right.
It's not about technology replacing humans. It's about using technology to, enhance the coaching experience.
Exactly. And empower both the coaches and the athletes.
Yeah. Well said.
Yeah.
This has been such a great conversation.
I agree. It's been really fun to talk about all this with you.
Yeah, we've learned so much. Yeah, we went from those simple whiteboards to All the complexities of wearable technology.
And the apps.
Yeah, and the apps. It's amazing how much is happening in the world of CrossFit.
Yeah, it's a really exciting time to be involved in fitness.
It really is, and I can't wait to see what the future holds.
Yeah, me too. So for all our listeners out there who are, part of the CrossFit community or just fitness enthusiasts in general,
Yeah, what's the one big takeaway you want them to remember?
embrace the data, but don't let it overshadow the human side of fitness.
Ah, I like that.
Find coaches who really care about you and your goals and who see you as more than just a set of numbers. Yeah. And at the end of the day, the most important thing is how you feel. Right. Are you getting stronger, healthier, happier?
Those are the metrics that really matter.
Exactly.
Well said. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of part 2 of our deep dive into data digitalization and the human touch in CrossFit coaching.
It's been a pleasure.
So we've talked about so much, from whiteboards to wearables to apps.
Yeah.
But I keep thinking about, how sometimes you get a fancy new gadget and then realize you only use like 2% of its features?
Oh, totally. Happens to me all the time.
I'm wondering if it's kind of the same with all this fitness tech.
Yeah.
Like, are we so focused on the data that we forget to, enjoy our workouts, connect with our bodies,
Right.
and just move for the joy of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's something that Krugley and Tucker actually bring up in their research. They talk about how some coaches are worried that all this data could actually be bad for the training experience.
Yeah, they mentioned coaches like Finn who prioritize, observation and that personal connection over just looking at numbers.
Exactly. And it's easy to lose that human element.
Yeah, like that intuition that good coaches develop.
Right. And remember Coach Leia's point about how sharing data publicly can create those unhealthy comparisons.
Yeah, not everyone wants to be in that hyper-competitive environment.
Right. For some people, it can be really discouraging.
Especially if they're new to CrossFit or already feeling self-conscious.
Exactly.
So how do we find that balance? How do we use data to enhance the experience instead of taking away from it?
I think the key is to always remember why you're using the data in the first place.
Okay.
Is it helping you reach your goals? Is it giving you valuable insights? Or is it just a distraction?
So be intentional about it.
Yeah, and don't let the numbers become the only thing you focus on.
Right. There's more to fitness than just hitting certain metrics.
Sorry.
It's about how you feel, how you're moving, whether you're enjoying it.
Right.
And that's where a good coach can really make a difference.
Absolutely. They can help you understand the data, make adjustments to your training,
Yeah.
and make sure you're not missing the big picture.
Right. And they can also help you understand the limitations of the data.
Exactly. Remember Malone and his colleagues mentioned those factors that can affect the readings?
Yeah, like data filtering and satellite connection.
Right. We can't just blindly trust the technology.
It's like those speed cameras that clock you going faster than you actually are.
Exactly. So we need to use our judgment and our critical thinking.
Yeah. And having a good coach can help with that too.
Definitely.
Well, this has been such an eye-opening deep dive.
It has.
I feel like I have a whole new perspective on the role of data in CrossFit.
Yeah, it's amazing how much technology is changing the game.
It really is. So for all the CrossFitters and fitness enthusiasts out there, what's the one big takeaway you want them to remember?
I would say embrace the data, but don't let it become everything.
Right.
Find coaches who prioritize you as an individual.
Yeah.
And who see you as more than just a set of numbers.
Okay.
And remember, the most important metric is how you feel.
Yeah. Are you getting stronger, healthier, happier?
Exactly. That's what really matters.
Beautifully said. Well, on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into data digitalization and the human touch in CrossFit coaching.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Until next time, stay curious, stay active, and keep pushing those boundaries.